Welcome everybody to this very special session, and it's very special because today we have a very special guest, Sigrid Kaag. She is the UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. But you didn't land in those jobs by coincidence. You have been at the heart of many of the world's most intractable issues. Whether in your previous incarnations in UNRWA, in UNDP, on chemical weapons, in the region also, in Syria. You've been also very special in the Netherlands, your home country, having been the first female vice premier, minister of finance, also foreign minister, trade and development ministers. You've been a lot of things. But for the purposes of this conversation today, we want to hear from you about Gaza, this very dark spot in the world's map, unfortunately. So if you agree, Sigrid, what we will do with this room, but also with our colleagues connected from the campus in Menton, whom we greet, even if it's only virtually. We will let you make a bit of a presentation to the students, and then we will engage in a Q&A together, but also with the room. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Arancha, and I think I would definitely want to first of all repay the compliment, because I think you've had so many roles, leadership roles, and you continue to shine. So I hope the students in Menton and here know how lucky they are to have someone of the caliber of Arancha lead. Let me give you one slight point of reference, give you my own take on the situation in Gaza, which is very hard to describe as a fellow human being, but also perhaps a link into some of the coursework I realize you're doing on international humanitarian law, international engagement, because I'm not an expert on international human rights or international humanitarian law, but I deal with the consequences, of course, of this horrific conflict to date. I have to take you back to Gaza in December 2023. You may recall at that time almost no humanitarian assistance entered Gaza. We're almost at a point zero. This is not a sort of theoretical example. It was 2 months after the horrific terror attack by Hamas, the taking of hostages. We only saw one humanitarian pause, a ceasefire, I think around November. I was still a deputy prime minister in the Netherlands, worrying about the budget or worrying about stuff one does when one is in cabinet. But it was the depth of the crisis. The council at the time couldn't agree to any resolution, if you recall, on a ceasefire. The parties were way far apart. They could only agree on one thing, and that was Resolution 2720, that basically asked for two big objectives. One of them is facilitation, coordination, acceleration, expedition, words to that effect, of humanitarian assistance allowed into Gaza. The second part was to establish a system that enables that, that supports that. You may recall from reading in the newspapers, there has been at one stage a maritime corridor to Gaza, a land route from Jordan, until the closure of Rafah border crossing on the Egyptian side, goods from Egypt allowed in or trickling in. But ultimately the goal was to reach people in Gaza in a sustained, systemic manner and to provide them with the assistance they're entitled to. This is a fundamental human right. It's also very fundamental and profoundly anchored into international humanitarian law. It made, however, my mission always as a temporary one, supposedly time-bound, as the hope of the negotiators at the council, but also big capitals of the world, Paris, DC, two examples, hopeful that a ceasefire would have been reached by that time. And of course, it's almost unconscionable to think that we are 14 months into this phase of the crisis, not necessarily a ceasefire in sight. You may know that certainly some of the negotiators have said, we're not doing anything right now because all our efforts have failed or not led to a result. But in the midst of this, You have on the one hand hostages that are still held in captivity, have had no visits by the ICRC or anyone else. We do not know, their families don't know, more importantly, about their well-being. And a civilian population, 2.1 million Palestinian civilians that are living in 11% of one of the world's most overpopulated areas, which is the Gaza Strip, mostly in tents, given the level of destruction, which is, in my visible eye, for me, it's unprecedented. I'm not comparing it to conflict A, B, or C, but the extent of destruction of dwellings, infrastructure, the social fabric in a way too, that has been deeply impacted. To me, in this day and age, for all conflicts that have affected Gaza, for Gaza, this is unprecedented. And what do we do at the end of the day? I visit Gaza as frequently as I can, because it's my duty to try to leverage, to mobilize, to get political support, but ultimately to have goods reach people, civilians, so children get their medicine, so better tenting is allowed in, that we can actually have medical staff, have the utilities they need to operate on people. We all know the horror stories of children having been amputated or having lost their limbs without anesthesia, because the medical material is neither available nor allowed in. The hospitals that have been bombarded, the schools, those still standing that are shelter. So many families living in a crammed former classroom. No schooling, no education. The list is extremely long. And what it shows, whether we speak international law, whether the Council speaks, Security Council, you need the political will to affect the change, the political will to arrive at a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause. Some of you may have followed the polio campaign, for those who follow the situation in Gaza more closely. It shows the parties, if they want to, they can. It requires a lot of hard work. Yes, for partners, humanitarian partners, it's implementation, but it can be done. We also need a massive, massive increase in the volume that's not only allowed into Gaza, but actually reaches people. Because from April till now, the total decline or collapse of law and order inside the Gaza Strip makes the ability of civilians, humanitarian workers are civilians, to reach people near impossible. So even if you have truckloads piled up, let's say that's no longer the problem, we can't get the goods in at great peril, great risk, and mostly looting occurs. Looting is a consequence of two things: scarcity, despair, and above all, in most war economies, and Arancha knows this too, there's always crime and criminal activity that is also on the rise. But there is no law and order. So you have civilians caught between the criminal activities of the looters or that sell it for triple prices. If, let's say, some of you that are familiar with the Middle East, you know that tomatoes usually are homegrown, they're cheap, they're nice. Well, Gaza, of course, has none of that. But the price of a tomato could have gone up to one tomato for $5, let's say. This is a huge price for a poor population that's been reduced to total poverty, no cash, all savings used, and has been reduced to bartering whatever products they've been able to obtain on the market. What does this tell you about human dignity? Dignity is at stake. Human rights are at stake. And in the absence of full compliance with international humanitarian law, everything we've established together as an international community, to my mind, is also at stake. So last but not least, and I think we may want to probably go into our Q&A, what do I tell every foreign minister I speak to? Almost ad nauseam, I would say, because we've been at this now for 12 months plus, and if we could say the situation has not deteriorated in Gaza, no, this is not the case. I wish we could say the situation is stable. No, this is not the case. I wish we could say sufficient aid reaches people. No, this is not the case. And I wish I could say that I'm sure it won't get worse, with winter around the corner, rain hitting Gaza, people are at risk in their very ramshackle tents, they're not safe. And I just mentioned to the professor that sewage, and it's an article in the Financial Times today, sewage might just flood through the strip. You just have to picture sewage in your tent, cold, dirty, disease on the rise. What do? We need to look at the principles and continue to demand the primacy of international humanitarian law. That means access, safety and security for civilians, the freedom to move inside the Gaza Strip wherever people want to move. And this cannot be subject to negotiations. Access to support, availability of assistance cannot be subject to negotiations. We may need to arrange, but that's different from negotiations. Secondly, of course, a lot of the problems we see today, the absence of law and order, is also due to the fact that there is no prospect yet of a return of the Palestinian Authority. Whereas actually they need to return. They need to be able to resume their role. They need to be able to provide for law and order. They need to be able to provide for the governance that is needed to render Gaza an integral part of a future Palestinian state. We do not need to make life very complicated in this regard. These are very straightforward, long-standing political premises. It's also important for a safe and secure Israel. The two need to coexist side by side. And ultimately, multilateralism, international action requires not only determination, it requires clarity, but we also owe it to ourselves to address the serious gaps that we can discern. Otherwise, we might live in a world where we are inadvertently part of an erosion or a further erosion of the very system we have established. It's far from perfect, but to my mind, it remains very essential. Is it important to be renewed, rejuvenated, improved, more efficient, better performance? By all means. But without this, chaos rules.
Thank you, Sigrid. Thank you. Let me ask you a first question. And I'm going to ask a few questions, but then please, as usual, there is 2 mics, one to the right and one to the left. It would be for you to put your questions to Sigrid. In which way is this? I mean, you've seen many conflicts in your life. I mean, and you have been. I still remember your assignment under the Chemical Weapons Convention in Syria, which wasn't an easy task. But in which way is this conflict similar or different from other conflicts that you've seen in the past?
Yeah, the Syria example is an interesting one. I led on the Syria Chemical Weapons Elimination Mission. The full title was the Declared Syria Chemical Weapons Program, and the key word is declared. There was unity of purpose of the Security Council. It almost seems as if it was 50 years ago, and it was 10, 11 years ago. Unity of purpose of the members of the Security Council. The Russians and the Americans agreed, of course, Chinese too, French and the Brits, they agreed that this was important. I would say, and I've often argued, that some member states of the Council perhaps didn't want the same outcome. It was a Chapter 6 resolution. Some may have wanted to go for Chapter 7, we'll never know. But there was unity of purpose, so we had full-blown political support. There was pressure on the Syrian regime. The Iranians were, in their own way, cooperative. So it was all made to work. It was a huge multilateral effort, politically, militarily, and with financing. This conflict, of course, is very different in nature. It is protracted. I think most Israeli officials will argue it is all an outcome of the Hamas terror attack of the 7th of October. At the same time, we also know that if you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict or Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is still the discussion on the two-state solution, political negotiations, status West Bank, Gaza. I'm not connecting the two on purpose, let me be very careful here. But the conflict is a big name. If you look at the hostilities and the military operations in Gaza as a result of the response to the attacks of 7th of October, This needs first and foremost a ceasefire. But a ceasefire alone doesn't address the issues of statehood and the process of a two-state solution. Of course, a Security Council resolution, I think 2735, has pointed to that. And there are long-standing UN Security Council resolutions that pave the way. It is also the stated position of the UN and many member states, if not most member states, that the only outcome will be a safe and secure Israel and an independent, viable Palestinian state. However, the profound humanitarian crisis, the catastrophe in Gaza, also means we really need to keep our eye on the ball, save lives, restore dignity, invest in education, make Gaza livable again for the Palestinians of Gaza that are in Gaza. And that has to be an equal priority.
So you tell us that absent political will is very difficult to make big steps, but what are the smaller steps that maybe can be undertaken in not in the months to come, but in the hours to come?
Well, actually, there are some of the commitments that are made by Israeli officials, because ultimately, I would say almost all decisions are made by the Israeli cabinet, by the prime minister, and I often report to the Security Council on what was indicated to me will happen. That could be opening of crossings, increase in volume, allowing winter goods to be entering in. But my response to that is, we take note. It's a duty under international humanitarian law, but the only thing that matters is if it reaches people. It doesn't matter that we have intent, commitments, which are important. It has to translate into a meaningful change of the situation on the ground. And this is key. And here my very sober and somber start at the beginning speaks actually to the reality of life in Gaza as it is today. It is pure, basic human survival of a former middle-class population, highly educated, willing to go to school. I was always amazed when I went to Gaza. The professor was first in Gaza since 1998. I first went to Gaza in 1988, and my last visit in another role before this one was 2020. I was always amazed when you live in what we've considered for a long time the world's open-air prison. People still studied, got their degrees, dreaming, building houses, hoping to travel, getting PhDs, with a determination as if that, say, they had a Dutch passport and you could go anywhere. That same determination, incredible testimony to their willpower, it's a testimony to our humanity too. Human beings, wherever they are, whomever they are, they want to thrive. You want to make something out of your life. You want to be someone. Be the best you can in art. Be the best you can as a car mechanic, whatever it is. And I think that is something that will always stay with me.
A lot of the students in this room and those that are in Menton are either studying humanitarian law or want to study humanitarian law, and they have questions today. And they will be forgiven for having those questions.
I certainly hope you have questions. Also forgive me if I don't know the answer.
Is there still a space for humanitarian law?
Well, yeah, it's a tough one. To be honest, you could see me sigh because I find it a hard question. I think there's like a tale of two cities almost here. If there wasn't any space, we have to fight for the space. And I would say now, if you look around the world, just to extract ourselves from this particular situation, it is more important than ever before. But it's very hard for many of us to move from words and appeals to pleads, to plaidoyer, to actually making it happen. And I can fully understand that many young people, but particularly I think also the survivors of any conflict situation, feel very much left behind by the international community. Because words are only as good as your deeds. And actually it only matters when the change is meaningful and sustainable. And that gap needs to be bridged. This is also, I would say, something particularly for many Western countries. our sort of wonderful words, I'm putting on an old hat now as a former minister, it becomes parole, parole. But who cares? People that survive the worst conflicts, they don't come and meet you with sort of the UN Charter, or they don't come and say, as per Article X, I'm entitled to ABC. They know fully well what they're entitled to. They're entitled to our protection, to our assistance, and to our voice.
Thank you. Let me turn the floor to the audience. Let me start with you. You briefly introduce yourselves and you put your question too.
Thanks very much for being here, coming here. I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to keep it straightforward. What do you make of the death tolls? The current figure floating around is around 40,000 people. But the Lancet, right, this really credible medical journal, came out with 170. That's it's a huge difference. What does UNRWA make of the death toll? Thanks.
Maybe just for the record, I don't work for UNRWA, but UNRWA is one of the UN agencies, of course. It is the backbone of particularly all of the humanitarian effort and education, health and relief services in Gaza. Not only in Gaza, but it's of course essential in Gaza. I don't recall that Lancet figure. I think Lancet refers to secondary death that will occur out of the protracted crisis. I'm not one to contest that. I think it should all be a tremendous wake-up call, as it has been when it first came out, as to the ultimate human toll of this horrific crisis. That's one. The data collection has been difficult, but I think there's also been an attempt early on to almost disqualify the data that came out of the Ministry of Health because it was Hamas run. However, I believe WHO and other entities said, well, in the past, with other conflicts, they have been fairly reliable or quite reliable. And I sadly believe this is still the case today. We have no reason to assume it is different, and that's partly because the names and the registration on the national database for civilians in Gaza, they correspond. It takes some time, but we have reason to believe this is quite a fair indicative figure. There's worse, because there's many, many people unaccounted for, and we fear many are still lying, obviously deceased, under the rubble. So the death toll at this point in time will be higher. And then, of course, there is at the moment, the 14,000 people that are on a medical evacuation list waiting for permission to be evacuated. And a lot of them are so seriously ill, they risk dying while waiting. And their wait's been quite some time.
Thank you. A lady over there.
First of all, thank you for exchanging with us. I'm studying at PSIA, Human Rights and Humanitarian Action. So mine is more like a comment. I will keep it very short. But I heard a speech lately telling us, maybe I misinterpreted it, that we should choose neutrality. That usually if we are angry about the situation, it's more because we have a personal trauma related to the conflict, because we have been victims of conflict, or it touches us some way. And personally, I'm not. I'm a privileged person. But as you told us, human rights are at stake, and human dignity is at stake. So how are we supposed not to be mad? How are we supposed not to be hungry at this situation? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I can make one comment. Maybe I can help you a little bit as well. I was always taught, but maybe I'm wrong, that one can be neutral and impartial, but you don't have to be neutral when human rights are at stake. Impartiality can be misinterpreted, I think. One has to be very careful and precise. But that's it.
Thank you. Gentlemen over there.
Goedemiddag. Firstly, as a Dutch person, I want to briefly say that we very much appreciate everything you've done for our country, and that we very much miss you in our politics right now, let's put it that way.
Thank you.
But as a Dutch person, I also feel it's very difficult to see the leader of our biggest political party right now respond to the ICC arrest warrants by saying that he wants to visit Israel and support Netanyahu and Gallant. And I was wondering, how do you view many Western political leaders seemingly not able to understand the suffering of the people in Gaza and almost ignoring it?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think on the one hand, it's sadly the case, no matter how big the crisis, when time passes, and this is the experience of a lot of humanitarian crises, media attention wanes, people feel quite impotent, and they sort of start to think like, oh, well, there's not much I can do about it, and oh, it's always been complicated, or, as this is, of course, in this particular situation, it's conflictual for many people, emotions run high, so people like to avoid it. And that's the worst that could happen, to my mind, both to the hostages, if they risk being forgotten, as well as civilians in Gaza, just because we don't care enough. You have to care. Everybody else relies on all of us to not be forgotten. That's the least we can do. Now, politicians are politicians, I can tell you that. It's much easier to refer and pretend it's out of your remit or out of control. They also have obviously very fabled mantras you can hide behind for a long time. And I think it's their constituency, it's their own voters, and I would say it's particularly young people, be it from climate change to, phasing out of fossil fuels, whatever it is, going back to another hobby of mine. You need to keep us honest. Be out there, make your voices heard, from elections to opinion articles, whatever you do. I'm not here to obviously go and tell you what to do, but I think it's really important. But human suffering is easily forgotten, just because people think it's complicated. Yes, it's complicated, and precisely that's why you have to act from a position of privilege. Otherwise, it's pointless. And the world is not a safe place right now. So ignorance or negligence, I think, actually could also indirectly lead to an erosion of the very values you still have, you get to reap the benefits of. So do it, if nothing else, for your own society. Thank you. Graag gedaan.
Lady over there.
Well, goedemiddag as well. I'm also, was born and raised in the Netherlands, have lived there all my life. But my family, and in terms of ethnicity, I'm fully Israeli. And the question I had for you is, well, you previously worked with the Dutch government, and a lot of European governments have come under severe criticism for their seemingly unwavering support for Israel. Whether that's true or not is debated, but I do think we can see a certain support for Israel in a lot of the European countries. And my question is, right now you're in Gaza. How has being a part of the Dutch government, of a European government, impacted your experiences now there?
Could you explain that to me?
Essentially, European governments are facing criticism for a lot of support.
Okay,
for
you mean
Israel.
first Palestinians would react to,
Palestinians, organizations that you're dealing with.
Well, it's actually, in this case, I would say, I'll give you an additional point, it hasn't. Because they look at a, let's say, senior UN official. I think most people don't even know what I do, but it doesn't really matter, but it's like a senior person from the UN who's trying to help get aid in. So far I've been very well received. And when I go in, I go deeply coordinated, as it's called, with the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and the Israeli cabinet, because one doesn't move without permission for one's own safety, and it needs to be, let's say, planned in that way. I also speak Arabic, so that helps. I think it's just the way you conduct yourself. But most Palestinians in Gaza know, and I only speak with whom I know to be civilians, they are profoundly desperate and deeply grateful at the same time. But they also feel, to my mind, very much forgotten, and probably later on will feel betrayed by the international community, by our inability to change the course. Now, with the Israeli government, I think it's helping me a lot that I was also an elected party leader. I was in government at senior levels, and I've had different roles. So it gives me a different status, in a way. It's sort of a very strange thing. I never thought I would say this in the past. I didn't believe this. I actually now understand better how let's say a true politician, how their mind functions. I don't think I ever became a true politician. I like to think to my credit. But I think it gives me a sort of bit more street credibility to be talking and negotiating at a political level. Thank you.
Thank you. Lady over there.
Hi, this is Candace, and I previously worked with UNICEF in Sudan, so another forgotten crisis in the world. And I have 2 questions on mainly humanitarian actions. And I think the first question is, the UN is currently under attack. Israel has banned UNRWA for operating, and I think you as the coordinator, what is your take on this? Are there any action from the UN to regroup, or how do you continue doing your work you're doing? And the second question is on the impact of the ICC warrant what are the impact of that warrant on humanitarian action? Do you think that it brings more humanitarian access, or it actually pull the parties away from negotiation tables? Thank you.
Well, the second question I have to answer you quite formalistically. The ICC, of course, is an independent organ, and we take note. I can't say if it makes a difference or not. It's an independent process that's taken place. That's before the court. We continue our work, regardless, obviously. I think the only metric, I keep saying, is where the goods get in, where the people have actually what they need to sustain themselves, to get healthy again, to have access to medical care. That's the only thing that matters. And you can count it, and you can see it, and you can measure it. Now, on UNRWA, the UN's position, Secretary General, my colleague, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, and most member states have been very clear. It has a mandate, which is given by the General Assembly. The organization needs to be able to function. There are treaties, there are, let's say, agreements made. And it is not for the occupation authority to singularly, unilaterally determine that through Knesset legislation. The facts on the ground, how they will unfold, I honestly don't know. And that obviously is the difficult and the tricky part. Separately, it's important to underscore that where UNRWA staff have been confirmed to be complicit or to have acted, or have participated in the horrific acts of 7th of October, of course, all the appropriate actions need to be taken, and the Secretary General has taken that very seriously. There's been an independent investigation, and other review reform measures of UNRWA are underway. That doesn't happen at one split second, because at the same time UNRWA is working day and night in Gaza, and it's lost a lot of its national staff. I believe, I always worry that I get one number wrong, but about 250 staff members, UNRWA alone, have lost their lives. So it's a very sensitive, very tricky period right now, because the Knesset legislation that was adopted gave a window of 90 days. And I think, I can't remember now when it was adopted, end of October, 28th of October, I believe, yeah, so we don't have much time. But the position of the UN to date has been to hold firm.
Thank you. Over there.
Hello, and thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Claire McCorry, and I'm a master's student in human rights and humanitarian action. And my question, or maybe more of a comment, was that we hear a lot about the issues of aid entering Gaza, and we've heard about the problems that will happen that when aid doesn't enter Gaza. But we don't hear why aid isn't entering Gaza. Why can't we put a name on those who are stopping aid from entering Gaza? You said yourself that 250 UNRWA members were killed. We can see that Israel isn't standing with international human rights, with international bodies and NGOs, and anyone trying to help humanitarianly. So why can't the international community name the problem, name what's happening with the aid, and why are we tiptoeing around a nation that isn't tiptoeing around anyone else?
I think there are perhaps 3 points in your question. One of them is there are a lot of statements and reports that are being issued by different organs or representatives of the UN. Secretary General is one, Commissioner General of UNRWA, or you're all familiar with OCHA, probably the Office of the, what is it actually, Coordination of Humanitarian Action. They issue a lot of data, they monitor, and they report on this. There's also monthly reporting to the Security Council by a special coordinator for the Middle East peace process. It's available, perhaps it's not a one-stop shop. My mission is a very peculiar one, I would say. I've been flown in as a political troubleshooter, overlaying all those systems to try to singularly build systems to get aid in via sea, via air. The least we want to do, of course, expensive, and it shouldn't be like that, and by land, and within Gaza. And we report also, quite specifically, but I can't always say it is one cause in the case of aid availability or distribution. Because let's say COGAT, the coordination office of the IDF, will say, well, we allow everything in. And we say, no, your definition's too narrow. Both are true. Or in a limited fashion. Then COGAT might say, well, the UN is not coming to pick up the trucks. And then we say, yeah, because it's not safe and secure and it gets looted. As the occupation authority, you need to provide for safety and security. So sometimes the story is more complex and more difficult. My mission is not to pinpoint apportion blame. My singular goal is to solve every obstacle on my way, but indeed also to report what hasn't worked, and the conclusion is pretty self-explanatory. But I hear you, but there are different organs that are doing that. The point is also political will. If the UN, the humanitarians, keep talking about what isn't working and point to the solutions, the UN is the weakest link, the most exposed as a humanitarian actor. Many of my colleagues have lost their lives. But we need member states to exercise their sovereignty. And we need a council that is unified in its voice. And that, so far, as you've seen with recent resolutions that don't get voted in, I have no opinion on the merits of the resolution. It's not happening. The UN is only as effective as the unity of purpose of the member states. It's sad, but simple, and that's the truth.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. Lady over there.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. My name is Sara Feletto. I'm a student in a Master's of International Security.
Can you get close? Sarah, can you get close to the mic?
Oh, yeah, sorry, apologies. My name is Sara Feletto. I'm studying a Master's in International Security. And my question for you today relates to humanitarian pauses. You've mentioned this concept, which, as far as I can tell, as I've gathered in my research, was a first in UN Security Council resolution language last year for this conflict. And essentially, it aims for the same goals as a ceasefire to help people, civilians, in a conflict zone, but it does carry a much lighter political weight. And it sets a very clear, limited time frame on humanitarian delivery and almost subordinates it to the military goals of the conflict. Now, this was essential to get essential delivery of humanitarian aid to Gazans, but looking at broader implications of this concept, do you think that this was only the result of this lack of unity in the Security Council for this conflict, or might it reflect a more broad shift in how we relate to conflict resolution and humanitarian deliveries?
Yeah, I think it could be the latter. Now, here I've been out of the UN for 7 years, so bear with me. But let's say in the days of Sudan, in the 1980s, there were what they called days of tranquility. And it was basically to get food in or do a polio vaccination campaign. Lebanon, 2006, I believe, I could be wrong, but one of those was the same. So it's not a new concept, but it's been the most promoted because nobody could agree to the language or the conditions of a ceasefire. So I think in this day and age, it's come back on the scene. At the same time, it actually also speaks to the total absence of political will to arrive at a ceasefire. I always feel it is, it's better than nothing, but at the same time, we shouldn't take our eye off the ball. Hostages to be released unconditionally, and people to be reached in safety and security. You don't want to reduce and get sort of almost boutique approaches to what is a core fundamental principle of international humanitarian law. At the same time, you're living in the reality of a war zone, and one has to be pragmatic and always make the choice, does it help people or not, without becoming unprincipled. So it's a very strange juggling act all the time.
Thank you.
Goedemiddag, vice-minister-president Kaag. I had a question for you.
Are you also Dutch or you're Belgian?
Yeah.
Okay. Just now getting very curious. All these nice Dutch students in Paris, good for you. Yeah.
Dutches are everywhere. It's not normal.
No, that's true, but it's still nice to see.
I had a question, like what's going to happen in Ukraine? Who is concretely gonna rebuild and reconstruct Gaza? Is it like BlackRock or Bouygues or Vinci? Who is concretely going to be the first on this future new market?
No, it's a good question. Sadly, we're not there yet, and that's for two reasons. Until we have clarity on the governance and security arrangements of Gaza, for the UN, governance should be the PA, but perhaps if you follow the scenarios that some member states are promoting or solutions that are just out there in international political articles, you'll find that some countries will want a long transition and only a nominal link to the PA for governance of Gaza. Others want, of course, the UN, the return of the PA. Third parties want an international consortium with locally chosen Palestinians of Gaza, but not connected to statehood, as it would be through the PA. And all that matters on the political buy-in by serious financiers, member states, but particularly the Gulf, for the investing in recovery and reconstruction. We have the plans, we've done the damage assessment, we have the early recovery planning. The Palestinian Authority has very detailed sectoral plans for education, health, water, you name it. It's not a lack of capacity or intellectual ability to drive this agenda, but it's pure the politics around governance and security that will make countries very reticent, to my mind. Separately, there'll be financing from the World Bank. Perhaps the IMF could play a role. Again, the governance is very important. And then you have a lot of private sector, Palestinian diaspora leaders and investors that will come on stream. But the extent of the destruction is so huge that we need sustained political commitment. If, again, member states say, well, do it with a little bit of overseas development assistance, forget it. This is serious money. Ukraine has the EU, it has the different funds that have been established, and it has the ability to raise taxes. You know, liquidity was always the point we financed in the Ukraine. I'm not underestimating the cost or the projection of Ukraine's reconstruction, but Gaza is a particular case in point, I would say. But the plans are there, and the financing, I'm convinced, will be found. But governance and security, and in the midst, we can fill in the plans, so to speak, with the money.
But are they today firms saying that they are interested to go and invest there, or not?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for BlackRock, but I think there will be different companies, different constructs. We also have to think of different financing instruments, risk guarantees. You have a lot of companies that will want to know who's sort of covering their risks and which kind of schemes. This is where the bank comes in, the different instruments it can provide. So you use soft money, ODA with a little bit of low interest rates, loans to offset the larger expenditures or the risks companies would be asked to take. Public-private financing, the sky's the limit. It's not about which companies. It's really about the framework against which we're asking investors to take risks. And then I'm quite convinced there is very serious money waiting to be invested, also from the Palestinian diaspora. Okay. So they're there. Yeah.
Okay.
And if you're interested, I'll connect you to them once I know.
Okay. Bedankt.
All right, graag gedaan.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mauricio Duran. I'm also in international security here at SIA. My question was going back to another question that was asked before. In this situation where you basically have a population that has lost all of its agency, that is confronted with the occupation that clearly does not respect international law anymore. We've seen what happened with UNRWA. We saw that even the Secretary General of the UN was declared a persona non grata in Israel. At what point do you think the international community needs to take maybe a more coercive position towards Israel? Because in this situation, we see that the Israeli position is radicalizing itself. There's now open talks of ministers in the Israeli government talking about an annexation of the West Bank, a long-term occupation of Gaza, a resettlement of Gaza. With all of this in mind, at what point does the international community maybe need to take a more coercive approach towards Israel, as it did with other countries in the past?
Yeah, I can give you my formal UN answer, which is sort of, that's really beyond my pay grade, this one, but I hear what you're saying. I think this is, frankly speaking, the mirror I hold up to a lot of the foreign ministers. You cannot ask humanitarian action or actors to solve a problem which also requires political leadership, guidance, and it's up to the different countries, and the international community is not a monolithic bloc at all, especially on this issue. They need to be able to think through for themselves which path they want to walk. International humanitarian law is at stake, the credibility of the international system, and ultimately also in the very urgent form that we face now is human life, human dignity, survival in Gaza. But you cannot treat this as a mere humanitarian crisis, because it's not. It's a catastrophe, but ultimately you'll find that the Secretary General each time also brings it back to the importance of a political solution. And this is where the different member states, I don't think, see eye to eye. And you see that very clearly.
Yes, and if you personally had to tell them...
Sorry?
If you personally had to give them recommendations on what to do, would you recommend an application of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter?
Well, there's no such thing. You'll learn that when you have these types of jobs. There's no such thing as a personal opinion. Not in a public forum. No, this is to be debated. Frankly speaking, we're seeing big shifts. We have a new US administration coming in. The Security Council, let's wait and see how it will continue to operate. I can't tell. It doesn't really matter what, let's say in this case, the UN never advises on what the Council should do in terms of resolutions. That's really the responsibility of the Security Council members. They have to take stock and they have to assess. It's their credibility too that's always at stake.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, well tried. Over there.
Yeah, kudos. Oh, sorry.
Hello, my name is Ines. I am a student in the Masters of International Governance and Diplomacy. First of all, I wanted to really thank you for the work you do. It is very incredible, and it is very, it makes me really happy to see that some people are not trying to deny what is currently happening in the Middle East. I often find myself wondering, how does the state of Israel get away with what it is doing and with all the violations of human rights it has been making? So my question to you is, according to your experience, do you feel like international law has any weight or any concrete power at all? Thank you.
Yeah, power, I think sadly not in any situation, is on the one hand the willingness and will to be in compliance, to be seen to be delivering, regardless. I'm not now focusing it on Gaza. What you do see and realize, and I believe our colleague here in the front, excuse me, what was your name again? Sorry? Tal could maybe confirm that too. Since the 7th of October, within Israeli society, I'm not talking now even about the politicians, there is a tremendous inward grief. On the one hand, the hostages have not been returned. That's the focus. There is the front in Lebanon from an Israeli perspective, and the war in Gaza, and let's say people have relatives that fight in Gaza. I'm describing this neutrally, but the empathy factor on both sides It's just there is no space to consider even that there are victims. I believe, I don't read the Hebrew press, that it's actually only the Haaretz newspaper that systematically reports also on Gaza. Am I right, Tal? Well, right, but at least, am I describing it appropriately? So in that regard, there is, in a way, a space that doesn't debate what's happening in Gaza. The absence of international journalism and media presence in Gaza is another factor that is quite dangerous, because you want independent reporting. You want everybody to be aware what's happening in their name as well. But we're not getting to that point of discussion yet. So is it at stake? I think for us collectively. And you're a generation, to my mind, that needs to stand up and fight for the universality of the principles that still hold for every human being, whomever they are and wherever they are. Otherwise, we are entering an even more dangerous world. And I'm not naive in this regard. Dean, Arancha and I spoke about this. To have ideals doesn't make you naive. You can be quite realistic, but you've got to have ideals. Life is more than just your own little being. And I appreciate you doing all these courses, because that's what it's all about. You will drive the change. I'm convinced about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ines.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here today. My name is Nathan Hatchett. I study international governance and diplomacy, and I concentrate on the Middle East. As an American, there's an inherent sense of guilt surrounding this humanitarian crisis. And my question is, despite the incoming administration and our staunch support for Israel, do you see a place for the United States and other members of the Security Council in distributing humanitarian aid from now and until in the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes and no. I think the US needs to continue to drive and use the instruments of leverage and pressure it has to change the situation. So far, this whole year, with all the shuttle diplomacy, with all my respect, it hasn't yielded, as we know, the results one would have expected or liked to see. But the US being on the ground, if that's the second part of your question, I don't think so. And I don't think they'll want to take the risk. But you never know. Again, it depends on what kind of arrangement maybe gets constructed, which requires a potentially remote presence. Now, US CENTCOM is present in the region, of course, and has been a critical, positive enabling factor in the maritime corridor. But the Palestinians can do it if they get the space and the freedom to do it. And all of us should actually be supporting their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Cecilia. I'm also in the Masters of International Security. We're seeing that UN personnel and other organizations like Doctors Without Borders are being targeted. And I want to know, what do you think this will mean to other conflicts now that such a basic part of humanitarian law is being completely broken with fairly no opinion about, no cry from the international community about it?
Yeah, or a lot of cries, but no change. Yeah, I think this is a very dangerous. Every situation, every crisis presents a negative precedent. So I think that can be a very real example that you're citing, that for future crises, it could be that countries wrongly or rightly refer to situation A or B and say, well, the Council didn't adopt a resolution then, so no need now. Politics is very cynical usually in that regard. And when a war is fought, we have systems in place precisely to protect the warring parties in a way from their own worst selves. That's the whole point of international humanitarian law, to give a framework, to be a reference, to protect you from doing worse onto others, because war is a cruel thing. But I fear in most conflict situations, precedents have been set, and not as inspirational models, far from it. No. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take the last two questions.
Good afternoon. Thank you for speaking to us today. My name's Oscar. I'm in international security from Australia. My question is quite specific regarding the issues of sort of crime, looting of aid trucks going into Gaza. The FT reported that stories of IDF soldiers not actually attacking looters, allowing them to sit close to the land routes that go into Gaza. What is the plan to approach this issue, especially given you cannot, well, reportedly you can't trust the IDF to actually attack this issue directly. So what's the plan?
Yeah, well, that's the multi-million-dollar question, I would say. We've been struggling with this, to be totally honest. We've asked early on in the period for the return of the so-called blue police. The Israelis refused. Basically, blue police was Palestinian police, but they were, in those days, still Hamas appointed. We said, okay, change the heads, obviously not physical elimination on our behalf, but change, and let's have your average policeman just protect the convoys. And that worked on off, but they were often targeted too, so of course you can figure it out. They said, no thanks, and the Israelis didn't allow it. Then there is an effort of parts of the Israeli government for us to allow private security contractors. That is not our thing. If you only have to think back of Iraq, not Black Rock, I'm saying to my Dutch friend there, but Black Water. You know, that's not an experience the UN wants to be associated with at all for issues of human rights, violations, we don't know who these people are. But the commercial sector, when they were allowed to move goods, used so-called private security contractors. But you have to paint the following picture. You have a truck that goes through, a few guys with big guns, and they sort of wave them at a civilian population. That's not our solution either. Currently, there are some plans that the IDF says they might consider, rather at a political level, that a private security company would be part of securing the route, and then further up, UN or international NGOs could distribute. We are not against that, but we will have nothing to do with it. And it has to be very clear that the private security is affiliated with the IDF and not with the humanitarian worker. So we've run out of options, frankly speaking. So you come back to the baseline, we need a ceasefire, we need the hostages to be released. There is no substitute to a ceasefire. Everything else is not even second best, it is like 10th best in a horrific crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you, and last but not least.
Thank you. My name is Alicia Filiberto. I'm a master's student in international security. And as you were also saying, now there is a need for ceasefire, and we talked a lot about the importance of ceasefire and humanitarian pause as well. And my question is more like, also, as you said before, the issue with the respect of Palestinian freedom and freedom in general, human rights in Palestine and Israel has been long-standing, also before October 7th. And so my question is, even though a ceasefire, even if we manage to get a ceasefire, what would be the future after that? What would be the steps to make sure the freedoms and human rights of people are actually respected and implemented in the region?
Yeah, it's a very good one. It's easier to paint and to state what is needed than to actually get there, as the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has shown. But since the Oslo Accords, since the signing of the Accords, the Palestinian Authority was established. Are any of us saying it's perfect? No. But these are legitimate Palestinian institutions, and they need to be permitted to return back to Gaza, to resume their functions. Until that happens, I'm afraid we'll deal with a quagmire situation that we get offshoots just because politically some want to avoid ever talking about a Palestinian state. And the Palestinian Authority, yes, needs to be reformed, corruption needs to be addressed, but they are integral to realization of Palestinian statehood, alongside a safe and secure Israel. But the twilight zone is a very dangerous one, because the twilight zone could be a protracted one. You could have very murky governance arrangements which get you no closer to anything that resembles the first steps towards statehood. And that's where politically member states need to keep their eye on the ball and adhere to what has been agreed upon for quite some time. This is not novel. We should avoid, I think, entering into so-called innovative arrangements because they're tactile. The strategic choice has been made quite some time ago.
Thank you.
Well, we have this famous author, Chesterton, that said that impartiality is a pompous name for indifference, and that indifference is a very elegant name for ignorance. But I think we are defying Chesterton today. First, we don't want ignorance. Second, you have shown to us, Sigrid, that you can be impartial, but you certainly will not accept to be indifferent. And I think if there is a message that you leave us with is this one, which we wholeheartedly take and which we will continue to work on. Thank you very much for being with us today, to all of you for being here, to colleagues in Menton for joining us virtually. A big applause to Sigrid.